Hey there, Tristan from PSI here. Let's talk about exhaust headers. 10 things about them. First of all, you can have a boost leak in your exhaust header, especially in turbo applications, and they are just as bad as they are in the intake system. So, in fact, you'll end up with boost pressures PSI greater in the exhaust header than in the intake. So, we want to make sure that there are no leaks. Number two, part of that is cleaning the surfaces. So any of your mating surfaces between the headers and the heads, maybe between the headers and the turbo, make sure everything is cleaned properly. Get rid of any sort of rust, especially if there's cast iron headers, if there's mild steel crossover pipes. Make sure all of that is cleaned. Use an ultrafine Scotch-Brite, make it look good and clean and smooth, and then you won't have any problems. When using your nuts and bolts, we want to use an anti-seize because all the metals are similar. The bolts, the nuts, the studs, you want to use high quality, grade 10 or greater, rated for high heat. The Subaru OEM spec is perfect. With that though, we will use an anti-seize lubricant, something like Permatex. This is good to 1,600 degrees Fahrenheit. Unless you're doing something very wrong, this will do just fine. Up next is your torque specs. You're bolting these headers into an aluminum head, so make sure you get the factory spec correct. For Subaru, 29 foot-pounds between the bolts and the studs for the aluminum heads, and slightly more for the crossover pipe. I think it was like 31 foot-pounds. Use a quality gasket, number 5. Multi-layer steel is king, but those gaskets need to be a good quality. Let me show you a good and bad quality. So here's a poor quality gasket. The inner ring is the same, it's actually less in terms of thickness compared to the rest of the gasket material. This will and tends to fail. This is a good gasket. This is a multi-layer steel gasket. With a very raised inner edge. This inner edge is the ring that actually seals and takes that compression and creates that airtight seal. Up next, retorque your nuts and bolts for your headers. Especially after a couple of heat cycles, everything's going to settle, and we want to get everything back into spec, otherwise you will produce and you'll end up with some boost leaks further down the line. Number 7, heat shielding. Of course, you want to protect everything else in the engine bay from heat. You don't want it to get hot. Use as much shielding as possible. I love the stainless steel stuff that you have to weld in place. That stuff looks good and does the job well. Why we want it in the exhaust header specifically is we want to keep the volume of air in the headers as large as possible. So, as an opposite example, an intercooler cools the air to make it more dense so that we have more oxygen for the same amount of space. That dense air is great for combustion. But on the other side, after combustion, we have very hot air, and we want to keep it as hot as possible because hot air is not dense. It's very spacious. It takes up a lot of volume. That means that it's going to flow very quickly through the pipes. It also means that it's going to impart that energy to the turbine of the turbo a lot more efficiently. So we want hot, fast-flowing gases. In order to do that, we use heat shielding to both protect outside things from heat, but keep the heat in those pipes. That's essential. Number 8, up pipes. Some cars, there's a pipe between the headers and the turbo. Subaru does that. It's called an up pipe. Old Subarus, there's a catalytic converter in the up pipe. Get rid of that as soon as possible. It's a flow restriction, and they do break, and you end up with little chunks of metal in your turbo and a broken turbo. Get rid of that. Make sure that flows freely. Whether or not it has a flex pipe, people seem to argue that. It can be either. I think the stock Subaru one does have a little section of flex, so that's fine, but no catalytic converters. Number 9, pressure differential. So when purchasing a new header, a lot of people focus on the flow, the diameter of the pipes. Maybe they want a nice 321 stainless steel header. Those are very nice things. Those are very important things. But they need to come second to pressure differential. Pressure differential is the difference in pressure between two volumes. And the two volumes that we're concerned about is the volume of air after the exhaust valves and before the turbine, so that exhaust header space. And we're comparing that boost pressure to the pressure that exists between the compressor of the turbo and the intake valves of the head. Those two numbers compared will give you a ratio. So a stock Subaru is like 2.5 to 3 to 1. If you put a nice big turbo on there, something to make, 400, 500 horsepower, you'll see that number drop. It'll end up being closer to maybe 2 to 1. And then for flat out race applications, you'll see teams trying to target an almost 1 to 1 ratio because it means efficiency. It means that we're using that exhaust gas as effectively as possible. That higher the ratio, that means more air is needed to get the pressure up in the compressor side of the turbo. So pressure differential is not really controlled by the exhaust header. It mostly is affected by the type of turbo. Only at very high volumes of air, we're talking high amounts of power, does the flow of even the stock header on a Subaru EJ255 really become a limiting factor. In fact, point number 10 is that you can get 500 horsepower out of a stock EJ header because that pressure differential is what's controlling the power and the efficiency and things like that. A lot of times, to get 500 horsepower, this pressure differential is only at about 2 to 1. And at 2 to 1, that flow rate, your headers aren't the limiting factor. It's still the turbo and potentially what's after the turbo, backing the turbo up, so as to speak. So pressure differential is very important. Rather than spending $1,000 or more on a fancy header, maybe put that money towards a different kind of turbo or the supporting mods so that you can have a bigger turbo. And then that way you get a little bit more bang for the buck. But there you go. 10 things about exhaust headers. Hopefully that helps some of you. Please ask any questions in the comments, and I'll do my best to get back to you.